Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Cable. I am the director of MindCore, and it falls to me to introduce the lecture series that has brought our esteemed lecturer here today. Um, After earning his medical degree at the University of Tehran, Dr. German Khodadad came to the United States and did a residency first in neurology and then in neurosurgery at the University of Pennsylvania. He subsequently spent most of his career at the University of Cincinnati as a practicing neurosurgeon and before retiring in 2002. And since retiring, Dr. Khodadad has been a tireless advocate in highlighting the need for and also supporting research on the neurobiology of excessive pathological selfishness and aggressive behavior in the hopes that this would help us to understand both the causes and potential solutions for so much pain in the world. These efforts have involved writing this book, The Antisocial Mind, What Makes People Turn to Violence. They have involved directly supporting research, including research here at Penn by Adrian Rain, Ted Brotkin, and myself. And they have included endowing this lecture series, the GVR Khodadad Lecture Series, which is now in its 13th year. I know that Dr. Khodadad believes very strongly that we need to take a biological approach to understanding these issues. And so I think that I'm not going to steal Corinne's thunder for introducing the speaker today, but I will just note that an evolutionary perspective is one that we haven't yet seen in this lecture series, but one that I think resonates very nicely with Dr. Khodadad's view on how we should be thinking about these issues. So I'm going to hand it off to Corinne to introduce the speaker.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, a longtime friend and mentor of mine as well, Joseph Henrich. If there's one thing to say about Joe is he is one of the most creative interdisciplinary scholars studying human behavior today. And what makes his scholarship, especially exciting is his rare ability to identify patterns of human behavior within and between societies and develop rich, unifying theories that can explain those patterns. Joe had an unusual start to his academic career. He actually earned 2 separate bachelor's degrees. And I once heard him joke that when he was choosing majors, he simply started at the beginning of the alphabet and stopped at the A's. As it turns out, those A's were aerospace engineering and anthropology. Now, stopping at the A's might be true for his degrees, but certainly not for his scholarship. Joe's work spans all of the academic alphabet: anthropology, behavioral economics, cultural evolution, decision science, economics, field experiments, game theory, history, institutions, norms, judgment and decision making, and I can go on because I have the help of AI with this. But I'll just jump to the end of the alphabet: zoology as well. So Joe has even done some comparative work with non-human primates. So a few fun facts about Joe is that he actually grew up just outside Philadelphia and still, I hope, maintains a deep appreciation for some of Philadelphia's great cultural institutions, soft pretzels and the Sixers. Yep, still true. Okay, great. He's also a devoted Star Trek fan. And you might think that this stems from his early interests in space, but that's only part of the reason. He also likes the show because of its anthropological premise of exploration and encountering different peoples. Joe is currently professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University and previously held faculty positions at the University of British Columbia and Emory University. And his interdisciplinary work has earned him tenure across 4 different disciplines, which is pretty amazing. Joe has published more than 250 peer-reviewed papers, many in journals like Science, Nature, and PNAS. multiple times over. His work has been now, I don't know if you looked at this, Joe, has been cited about 99,000 times. So we're just shy of 100,000. Again, a remarkable feat that, which in Philadelphia, Joe, earns you a prize, a Philadelphia pretzel.
Oh, excellent.
Up for you.
Thank you. Joe. Thank you. That's wonderful.
The floor is yours. Live long and prosper.
All right. Wow. Yes. It's very rare that someone who knows me so well gets to do the introduction, but all true, actually. Okay, thanks again for that intro. So today, very happy to be speaking to such a diverse, intellectually diverse audience, because I've been working on this book for about 5 years. So you're going to see some snapshots of things I've been working on, and it's an ideal time for questions and feedback as I try to finish up the book in the coming year. So the plan for today is, first, I know everybody comes from different places, so I have to spend some time laying out the field of cultural evolution. So that's what I think of as my field. We're going to take an evolutionary approach to culture and then use it to think about creativity. Now I'm going to make a case that to think about creativity, we need to think about what I'm calling fractal collective brains, and thinking about the interactions between couples all the way up to continental-sized populations. So that's all by way of background. Then I'm going to give you 2 case studies. One, we're going to look at innovation during the period of time when the US rises to global prominence. So between 1850 and 1940, we're going to use a combination of census and patent data to look at that, to test some ideas that I'll develop in the first part. And then we're going to look at a kind of unlikely hypothesis that it may be that the spread of the Roman Catholic Church actually spurred creativity in Europe. And this runs against a kind of intuitive notion, and we'll see why that might be the case. And then if we get time at the end, I'm going to discuss some gene culture coevolutionary ideas. And one of the things that come out of that is we may, to at least have some degree, have evolved to think in groups. And so it could be that a lot of the research on, say, human reasoning, judgment, and decision-making has been somewhat misguided because it's very focused on how individuals make decisions. And it could be that we actually think with our friends, and there's something else going on in that interaction besides just what goes on in one head. Okay, so jumping to the main theoretical idea that I'm going to be pursuing throughout this talk is that the things we're trying to explain are novel ideas, new technologies, innovative art, heuristics, music, so any kind of cultural endeavor this would apply to. I would make the case, and I'm not going to have time in this lecture to do this, that either all or almost all novel ideas, creative products are recombinations of existing ideas, things that are already circulating in some way in the cultural milieu. If that's the case, then we can see 3 factors that can affect the likelihood of creating novel recombinations. The first is the population size. So larger populations just have more minds, more brains in which these recombinations can be forged. But the ability to do that is going to depend on the cognitive diversity. So minds that have more different stuff in them are going to be more able to create these novel recombinations. And then finally, the psychology and the geography matters. So those people have to meet, usually. I mean, we can think about new technology too, but usually people have to meet, exchange ideas to make new baby ideas. So we're going to look at those 3 factors. Now, it's also possible that this can produce tools, heuristics. So one example I like is Arabic numbers. So that helps us do individual cognition, which can feed back into this system, creating a kind of loop. We're not going to get into that too much today, although feel free to ask questions about it. And in the book I'm working on, I'm arguing this applies to anything. I'm mostly going to focus on science and technology today because that's where I have some big data and it's easy to answer really complicated questions. You'll see languages fly by. And in the book, I have stuff on composers and music in the book. So, okay. Now, in the background, there is this pernicious folk model that, despite a lot of efforts by historians, remains strong. So this is the notion that where creativity comes from is the individual brain, that somewhere deep in that circuitry are these creative sparks that explain all the success of our species and all the things that are so impressive. And just to give you one sense of how this can get out there, this is a quote from Elon Musk on what was Twitter at the time. So humans are weaker and slower than other mammals. If it were not for intelligence, we would have long since died out. intelligence has obviously been the primary vector of human evolution and is underappreciated. What is underappreciated is that how much has happened in the last 10,000 years. There was an intelligence explosion 6,000 years ago with the sudden development of writing, agriculture, and elementary math. Now, I'm going to show you some evidence in a second that, in fact, something interesting did happen in the last 12,000 years, but that doesn't have to be due to a change in intelligence and change in what goes on within a head. It could be something about the population structure. Although, as a side note, I have to point out that I don't think any of these trace to 6,000 years ago. So just as a fact, writing is close, 5,000, agriculture much older, and then it's not clear what elementary math is. So, but there's a big picture here to be gotten to. Now, this is, despite a fair amount of scholarship going after the heroic brain, it's still everywhere. You still find it in journalism. I'm going to talk about Thomas Edison. When we tell stories about great inventions, we focus on the one or two great inventors. Patent law requires you to find legally the one true inventor, which presupposes that there is one true inventor. And it also impedes our understanding of human evolution because we tend to think, the magic's in the neural circuitry as opposed to between the minds. Okay, so thinking about human brains, the first thing that comes out, I teach the general education requirement on human nature, and one of the first points I make about human brains is they haven't really changed much in size in 300,000 years ago. But all the stuff we think of as cities and urbanization and fancy technology happens in the last 10,000. So there's no easy size story. Here's a little bit of data to show you. So this is cranial capacity based on measuring skulls. This is 30,000 years ago. And this is now. So if we look at what's been happening, if anything, brains have been getting smaller during the period. In fact, 6,000 years ago, it looks like brains were accelerating in terms of the rate of getting smaller. But this is the part where Professor Musk is correct, that in the last 14,000 years, the development of social index has been going up. So if you look at the ability to extract energy from the environment, writing, metallurgy, agriculture, all of these things are piling up in the last 10,000 years. So at the same time that this has all been accelerating, we have actually a shrinkage in brain size. It's noteworthy in thinking about this that if we look at these are different primate species, each of these dots, and this is brain size on a log scale, you can give primates a lot of different tests to measure their global cognitive ability. So these are things that psychologists might think of as executive function, problem-solving abilities. The best predictor of how different primate species perform on these cognitive tests is overall brain size. So bigger brains have more processing power and lead you to doing better, which means that humans now had substantially smaller brains than our Neanderthal cousins 50,000 years ago, and even smaller brains than our ancestors only 30,000 years ago. So that hopefully suggests a puzzle. Now, some might say that, well, maybe Musk is right. Maybe 6,000 years ago, there was a special mutation. But at least to a first pass, and here I'm drawing on Susanna Herculina Housel's research, human brains look like scaled up monkey brains. There's not an obvious difference between human brains if you just make them bigger than compared to a monkey brain. So all that is some background, but it does appear that maybe our brains were shrinking while our collective brains were expanding. So we were getting larger societies, that there were bigger populations that were more interconnected. Now, one reaction to this is to say, Joe, we know that, humans were figuring stuff out. I mean, we came up with the division of labor, and we invented agriculture, and we came up with fertilizer and weed killer. We began milking our species. We developed antibiotics, and, we have public health and much more. That would be an impressive list if it wasn't the list for ants. So it turns out these are things that ants have accomplished in the last 50 million years. And so they did all of that without any genius ant figuring it out. A slow process that operates over long periods of time was able to produce all this. What I'm suggesting is that all this was produced by a cultural evolutionary process of a large number of brains interacting over a period of time. So that's just that. And the funny thing about ants is the larger, more sophisticated groups, the really bigger groups of ants, the individual ants have smaller brains. So there is this thing going on in ant evolution where you can get a smaller brain if you can farm out your cognition. So one example of this is I consider myself to be an expert on the Hadza, but I keep all of my information in Corinne's brain. Okay, so this is the evolutionary approach. So to give some background here, so I'm thinking about genetic evolution, natural selection, phylogeny, our history as apes. We're using that to think about features of human psychology. I'm particularly interested in those aspects of human psychology that allow us to learn from others, that give rise to cultural transmission. There's lots of other interesting aspects of psychology. I'm going to talk about kinship and kin-based institutions, so that'll play a role there. But once this gets going, you have a process of cultural evolution, which you can build formal mathematical models and integrate that with genetic evolutionary models. And those give rise to all kinds of interesting products. So complex tools is what we're going to be focusing on today, but you get religious rituals and devotions, you get social norms and institutions, and language is part of that. Now, to understand human psychological diversity, you want to think about children growing up in these different environments, and we now have lots of evidence that our minds adapt ontogenetically to the culturally constructed worlds we have here. And we don't want to be dualists about it. These are biological differences between brains, just not genetic differences between brains. So our brains adapt plastically to the kinds of worlds they confront. And then, of course, in the longer run, there's a big feedback loop here. And this is what I focus on in my book, The Secret of Our Success. In this picture, what our brains really evolved and got big for is to acquire, store, and organize information it got from others. So we're good at learning, often from multiple people. And you'll see in the background there, we automatically get recombination. So humans look out into the world and we pull in information from diverse sources, which gives you recombination. So researchers taking this approach ask the question, so I'm a young learner, how do I know who to learn from? And there's a growing body of evidence that we integrate cues of success, skill, competence, health, and age, as well as cues of self-similarity to figure out who in our environment we're going to pay the most attention to, and we preferentially learn from them. So the idea is that we're aggregating from multiple models. Now, I could show you quite a bit of evidence. Infants less than a year of age show some of these cues. Young children are already using prestige cues. And then adults, of course, use these to learn an incredibly wide range of things. So we're learning from others, but in a more targeted way. One of the things is if you embed this in a kind of life history perspective and you think about this as children grow up, early on they're learning from members of their family. So this is when you get a lot of parental influence. But then, of course, they become adolescents and they begin to look out into the world. And that's when you can get a mismatch with the parents because they're using these cues to figure out who else in the world to learn from. And so this is a picture to keep in the background. And this will give rise to local collective brains, networks that seem to be especially good at acquiring and processing information. Now, one of the reactions I get to this is people are okay that we're cultural learners, but the creatives, they're the special people. They're the ones who aren't really copying, they're, buckling down and racking their brains, to quote a famous cognitive psychologist. Another way, though, that we might think about creatives is they're actually prolific recombiners who are just reaching a bit further, right? So they're recombining ideas that are more distant. And I want to show you some evidence that kind of point in the direction of this cultural transmission process. So this is work by Alex Bell and Raj Chetty, economists. Raj is my colleague at Harvard. And they studied US patents. So what this plot is showing that is if your father has a patent, you're 9 times more likely to have a patent as a son. Now you might think, well, smart fathers have smart sons, but the son tends to patent in the exact same domain as his dad did. So if your father patents in transistors, you patent in transistors. And if you don't patent in transistors, you patent in a nearby technology domain. So you don't go very far from, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this case. Fun thing about patents, which illustrates the power of same-sex role models, is you find this for fathers and sons, but not fathers and daughters. But you do find it for mothers and daughters, but not mothers and sons. So it's a same-sex vertical transmission. Now, of course, children also learn from the wider world. So what these guys found is that the higher the rate of patenting in the place where you grew up, but not necessarily live now, the higher your chances of getting a patent. So if you grow up in Silicon Valley, your chances of patenting are much higher than if you grow up in Brownsville, Texas. There's Philadelphia. Boston is here. But so it really matters where you grow up, and it parallels the same thing here. So if you grow up in Silicon Valley, you're likely to patent in computers. And the graph, I didn't put it on because it looks almost exactly the same, so it's sort of boring. But if you grow up in Boston, you're more likely to patent in biotech. So you're taking in this information around you in this kind of two-step process. So it at least applies to the patent database. The other thing that we should see when we look at the record of innovation and creativity from this cultural evolution perspective is most innovations should be incremental recombinations that build on previous stuff. We should expect serendipity, the role of luck, to play a big role. Simultaneous creation, I think this is a really important and underappreciated one. If it is the fact that what creative people are doing are just recombining ideas from the cultural milieu, then the same thing should be invented at the same time because different heads are putting together things in the same. And that's one of the things we really see in the historical record. Myopia will play a role in some of these other ones, which I'll leave behind for now. Just want to give you one example. So two famous innovators, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, founders of Google. First thing, serendipitous meeting. There's actually a lot of serendipity in this story, but just to give you one, they both went to Stanford because they both got rejected from MIT. They were met on a tour of San Francisco. Sergey was leading it as a second-year grad student in computer science, and Sergey was on the tour as a first year. Their invention, the Google algorithm, which all of you have used, I assume, is just a basic recombination. It combines web crawlers, which would have been common in the Stanford computer science in 1995, with the idea of popularity page ranking, that we can rank things in importance based on the number of other things that link to it. Now that seems like a brilliant idea, but we know where they got it from. Academics have long been obsessed with counting things like citation and H indices, and these guys have multiple academic parents each. So Larry has two computer scientists as parents. His brother worked for a social network company that was sold to Yahoo. Sergey's parents were Jewish-Russian immigrants. Father was a mathematician at the University of Maryland. Mother was a NASA engineer. So there's two STEM professors and multiple PhDs. So it's not hard to see where popularity page ranking came from. Now you might see, well, nevertheless, they were the two guys who came up with this. That must have been a hard idea to put together. As usual, there's a case of multiple invention. The year before them, Robin Lee, a Chinese immigrant living in New Jersey, patented a very similar algorithm. He couldn't get Dow Jones to pick up on his patent, so he headed to China and founded Baidu, which is Google's main competitor in China. Were they bold visionaries? At the time, they didn't know they were even doing search. They were trying to create a map and catalog of knowledge as it appeared on the web. After it dawned on them that search might be the potential use for this thing they had invented, they tried to license it for the whopping sum of $1 million to the companies at the time. So Yahoo, Excite, and AltaVista were three of them. They declined, saying search is not important. Turned out to be important. And then Dow Jones didn't pursue Robin Lee's innovation. So this is a classic story of innovation. So thinking about innovation, so it was important, your local environment is important, who you can team up with. So Sergey and Larry, it's important that they had each other as well as the other members of the Stanford Computer Science Department, which ended up being early in Google. They were at Stanford, so their neighborhood mattered. They were in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, that mattered. The proximity of that to other places like Seattle and Los Angeles probably mattered. It wasn't in Perth, Australia, for example. The country, North America, or the region, and then finally the continent mattered. So in the book, what I do is I go through all these levels and I just show you that every single one has a big effect on innovation. Just to show you one piece of evidence, not from my lab, which just illustrates the effects of teams nicely. So this is science. So this is 6.6 million journal articles. And this looks at the novelty, the likelihood that the publication is considered novel, and the impact factor the impact after 5 years, so how many citations it gets as a measure of the kind of scientific importance of it. Larger teams produce articles that are both more novel and have more impact in the future. So the dotted lines go here, and the straight lines go there. But what you find is that teams that have mixed gender are relatively more impactful. So the all-female teams and the all-male teams are less. The all-female teams are slightly more impactful than the all-male teams, but the best are the all-female teams. Now, the authors and others have asked, why does gender matter? Why does gender improve this? And the idea that I like is that they find a sex bias in citation. So males tend to cite males, and females tend to cite females. So if you mix them, then you get to cite everybody, right? So just in terms of the number of sources you can draw on, we're intuitively and unconsciously have a sex bias in who we pay attention to. All right. Okay, so that's just the team. Now I'm going to, in the sense of, this applies to a whole bunch of different things. If you look at neighborhoods, so this is research by economists comparing the regions within the same city that tend to produce the most impactful or unusual innovation. So this is a patent-based measure. And so we're only comparing neighborhoods within the same city. There's no city differences here. And what we find is that the denser parts of the city produce the more unusual or atypical patents. So it seems to apply to neighborhoods within cities, denser, more social interaction, more chance for recombinations. This is, of course, a classic finding. These are all US cities. I could pick any year. This is 1975. The larger the city, the larger the working age populations, the more patents it produces. This line is super linear, so it's as if the same person gets smarter when they move into a bigger city, or at least more productive in terms of producing patents. The same holds for pre-contact ancient Oceania. So this compares the sophistication of the tool technology across different islands in the Pacific. And what you do is when you find larger islands that are more socially interconnected, have more complex tools and more total number of tools. Oh, superlinear means if this were moving, this would have a coefficient of 1 if the number of patents was moving up the same as the population size. So the reason why superlinear is important is it's just saying that there's more here going on, just increasing the population. It's as if the individuals are getting smarter. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry about the technical terminology. Oh, languages. So this is true of number of words, number of phonemes, and certain aspects of grammar get more complex as the population size gets larger. And then finally, and I use this when I'm arguing with economists who want to give me some special case economic explanation for the 20th century, if you look at songbirds, male songbirds, these are larks in Spain, but when you have access to more models to learn your song, which male larks use to attract females, so a lot of incentives, they produce more complex songs and more different song types. So it looks like the larks are being affected by the collective brain as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. We're supposed to be here. And now I'm going to move into the origins of American ingenuity. But I want to do it with an example that comes from Thomas Edison. So I've done this a few times in popular talks, and I asked the audience, who invented the light bulb? And if it's Americans, you get a different answer if you do it in Britain. But if it's Americans, everybody says Thomas Edison. But this is something slightly closer to the actual story of the light bulb. The first thing to know about Edison is that he put together a research team in Menlo Park, New Jersey, where he had a lot of people working for him. And he went through over 16,000 different, or 6,000 different filaments tested, just recombining 3 elements. So to make a light bulb, you need to know what the filament's made of and what shape it is, what gas you're going to put around it, and how you're going to power it. Now, one of the members of Edison's team one time said, Francis Gell said, Edison is really a collective noun that means the work of many men, because he's got a big team there working together. Okay, but he still came up with the idea of the light bulb, right? Well, it turns out there were 24 patents on incandescent light bulbs before Edison showed up on the scene. And Edison got the idea when he was walking past the store in Boston, the store of a guy named Moses Farmer. Moses never did a patent, but he had made an incandescent light bulb that was hanging at his shop, and Edison saw it and was like, that's a good idea. So that eventually leads here. But there were all these other people in different countries working on the recombination that led to the incandescent light bulb. And this goes all the way back to a demonstration by Humphrey Davies, who was able to get some serious brightness out of some platinum wires because he had a really large battery. And if you go back before him, there were lots of anonymous tinkerers working on it. And this is where the Philadelphia part comes in. So this whole thing got going because Ben Franklin was in Boston visiting relatives, and he went to an event in which Archibald Spencer was demonstrating the power of static electricity. Ben, as was his custom, said, that is really interesting, and he bought the guy's equipment. He took it back to Philadelphia, and some of his buddies, Ebenezer Kindersley, showed that you could get incandescence out of a wire. And then eventually we get to Edison. As soon as Edison invented this, another guy had already invented in the same year, simultaneous invention over in Britain, and then someone made a better bulb the same year. And then eventually, this Russian immigrant makes his filament out of tungsten, and that's the one General Electric buys. So that's closer to a real story of innovation. All right, so we get the entire US patent database. To measure creativity, we're going to measure patents per capita and breakthrough patents per capita. That's just the really important patents. This shows you a map. The darker areas are the more intense patenting. Now, we want to measure cultural diversity. So how did we get that? So we did a lot of work to try to show that surnames capture a slice of cultural diversity. So we used a complete US census, and we can link this to occupational differences, so occupations cluster by surname, and we can link this to patent codes, so we can show the patent codes cluster by surname. We think this is a measure of cognitive diversity. And so the idea is to put these together. Now I'm hanging out with economists, so I'm trying to recombine elements I can steal from them. And one is some techniques, which actually started in psychology, then moved to economics, but we're going to use an instrumental variable analysis, which allows us to extract a part of the overall cultural diversity based on surnames that is due to immigration shocks. So something happens in Ireland, there's a bunch of Irish guys. Because a new trains opens in Bucks County, a lot of guys named Kelly end up in Bucks County. So there's this kind of randomness to this process, and we have a technique for extracting that. If we can get random variation or pseudo-random variation in surname diversity, then we can use that to try to explain this patents per capita and see if and we're going to look at both population size and cultural diversity. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is first the county level results, and then some individual level results, and then patent level results. So this is basically the whole story here. So more variation in surnames, and this is the random variation surnames that we can get using our technique. And this is the rate of patents per capita. So more diversity, more patents per capita. Pretty large increase. So the increase is 139% for a 1 standard deviation increase in surname entropy. This is for the breakthrough patents, so similarly sized. In all of our analyses, and I'll show you a little bit more detail in a second, we're only comparing counties within states. So none of this is taking advantage, none of this is exploiting the fact that the South is much less innovative than the rest of the country. Okay, so let's see, what am I showing you? So just to give you a sense of what's in this complicated table, which maybe I shouldn't have used, we have patents per capita, 4 different analyses of that, breakthrough patents per capita. And in each case, we're looking at the contribution of diversity and population. So 2 of my 3 key variables there. And we find that both are important. So population is important, independent of surname diversity, and vice versa. Now, this is the one that we interpret causally. And so you can see that these are large effects. And we can do all kinds of fancy things, which I'll skim by here. But again, we're often comparing only the county with itself. So we look at what happens when a county gets a shock of diversity and it gets more innovative. And we even account for linear trends. So let's account for the fact that innovation is definitely going up and look at only deviations from that. All right. This, I think this might have been the one that convinced the reviewers. So we found a way to track individuals through time. And so we find the same individual and we look at what happens when the county around them becomes more diverse. So when the county around you gets another standard deviation more diverse, the patenting of the same person increases by a substantial amount, and even more for the breakthroughs. We think this is a conservative, this isn't actually in the paper, but I think this is a conservative estimate because there's good reason to think that movers are more creative than non-movers. So we're just focusing on the people who don't change their residential address. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we don't find that population matters much here, because if you focus on the individual, my social network is probably not going to change. I'm not going to increase my social network size by 20% because the population in the city increased. But I could change the diversity of my network. So we don't find the population size. So again, here it's as if the same person, we're tracking the same people, gets smarter when the world around them gets more culturally diverse. Okay, now what about social interaction? Well, we needed a trick to see if people were assorting more, meaning hanging out with different kinds of people more, and then maybe what was happening to families. And then there's the informational channel. So we have these two channels that could be affected by surname diversity. This one we clearly have. So when we have more surname diversity in the county, we have more occupational diversity and more diverse patent codes. So that's easy. Now, if people avoided those who were more similar to them or more different from them culturally, then we could short circuit this effect on innovation because people wouldn't be interacting. What we find in the US during this period is the opposite. So as the counties get more diverse from these exogenous shocks, we find that people are more likely to live next to people who are more different from themselves. So the census, when they did the census, they went house to house so we can tell who your neighbors are. So we took advantage of that fact. Families also get weaker family ties based on a family ties measure. So it seems like surname diversity is operating through two channels. All right, and then finally we go down to the patent level. And what the analysis shows here is when counties get more culturally diverse, the people who actually team up to patent get more diverse. So if we look at the names on patents, we might have Edison and Latimer, so that's diverse, and Wright and Wright, or Johnson and Johnson. And so those are not very diverse. We hold the team size constant. We find a positive effect for team size. I should have that on here. So larger teams produce more breakthrough patents. But when patents are more diverse, they also are more likely to be breakthrough patents. So the county gets more people that are different on the patents, and the patents are more likely to be breakthroughs. They're also more complex. So we can look at the technology codes assigned to each patent, and that tells us how complex it is. So diversity leads to impact, and complexity is what that says. Okay, now in the background here, there's this point that immigration was actually driving a lot of this increase in diversity. So what this shows is, up until 1940, from 1850, immigration by generating cultural diversity and increasing population size actually fueled a lot of America's innovative rise. Now you might think, well, then people must have encouraged more immigration. In 1924, the US Congress famously, in a bipartisan vote, almost completely shut down immigration from anywhere except a small number of European countries. So despite this massive push on the economy, the politicians did not agree. Okay. All right, so that's now we're going to go to the Catholic Church and try to apply the collective brain model again. So now we're going to look at patenting in Europe, but soon I'm going to switch to another measure of creativity. So if you're getting tired of patents, don't worry. So this is patent data from 1980 to 2014. And this is very finely located geo-patent data. So we know right where the inventors were, similar co-authors. So you can see there's a lot of variation there with Europe. Now here's a puzzle kind of pitch. So we have a measure of how long each patch of ground, each population in Europe was under the medieval Catholic Church. Sounds crazy. Why would the medieval Catholic Church have anything to do with any of this? So time under the Catholic Church, patents per capita. Parts of Europe that had spent 1,000 years under the Catholic Church were they produced the most patents per capita and the most inventors per capita. So how could this be the case? And so this is an effort to kind of dig into this and figure it out. Now here's the pitch. Here's the sort of background theory. So this is recombinative innovation. I think that psychology plays a big role. So for the psychologists in the crowd, we're going to get to some psychology here. If people are more trusting and fair-minded towards strangers, more individualistic, and less inclined to conformity, you're more likely to interact with people, trust them, share with them, swap ideas, and make more baby ideas that result in patents. That's going to also be influence the sociality. So we have a measure of how far away your Facebook friends are. And we have regional interconnection measures as well as nuclear households, so a kinship measure. Now the story or the theory that I put out in my 2020 book, which is here, is that Europe is unusual in having very small families with high trust in strangers and low conformity and high individualism, because beginning in late antiquity, the Roman Catholic Church moves through Europe and dismantles Europe's clans and kindred. So think about the Celts and the Franks. These all had complex kin groups, breaks them down into monogamous nuclear families. So it was the particular marriage and family program of the Roman Catholic Church that resulted in this pattern. Just to show you a first pass, right? This has to be true, otherwise it's not an interesting next step. So these are measures of psychology across European regions for individualism, trust, nonconformity, and impersonal fairness. And what we find is that the places where people are more pro-social towards strangers, we see more patents per capita. More individualism and less conformity, also more patents. So it looks like there is a psychology connection, or at least some sort of something's generating the correlation. Again, for the identification crowd, we're only comparing regions within the same European country. So no national health care, none of that stuff's relevant. Okay, now in my effort to understand the psychological variation in this paper in Science, we looked at cross-national analyses, and we connected 3 dots here. So the first is that if you had more time under the Catholic Church, you should have smaller, more monogamous nuclear families. And so here we just look at, this is at cousin marriage, but time under the church results in less cousin marriage. If you have this less intensive kinship, you should have more trust in strangers, more cooperation with strangers, more individualism. So that holds up. And then of course, if those are true, you should be able to go directly. So more years under the church, greater individualism, greater trust in strangers, and so all that pans out. And we dig into detail looking at the variation among European regions, and we look at second-generation migrants. We have a study on Italy. But all this is background for where I'm going. Along the way, we created a database that had the spread of Catholic bishoprics. So these are administrative centers of the Catholic Church. And we have a GPS location, and we have a date. So we're able to say the intensity of all these different regions of Europe. And this is another picture of the data, so you can see the time up there. So it's 600, 700 AD, and these are bishoprics that are popping up through Europe. So we're going to take advantage of these spreading bishoprics. You might notice that some of them turn gray, and that's because that patch of ground was taken over by a power unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, so the Pope. And so you'll see that, Muslim conquest comes in here, and then all these ones get disconnected. There's various similar things going on here. Okay. Now, the question we had to ask ourselves, we had to be creative, was how can we measure creativity back in history? And so I'm interested in what people think about this. So on Twitter, somebody tweeted about this, and I looked at that. Maybe we can get something out of that. So I went to the guy next door. So my postdoc, Slava Szynski, is in the office next to mine. I'm like, hey, do you see about this database? Do you think we can measure creativity? And through the course of our conversation, I can't say who came up with it, we came up with this. So we found that this data set has 800,000 notable Europeans from year 0 to 2018. And we could put them into 2 categories. So we created a creatives category, people who were famous either primarily or secondarily for being artists, scientists, writers, or inventors. And there's another group of famous people who are nobles, generals, merchants, lawyers, and clerics. Now, someone like Thomas Aquinas, a famous Catholic theologian, we can run this categories different ways, but he's mostly in here, right? Because even if his primary thing is cleric, he's secondarily famous theologian, right? So, okay, so we can mess with those categories. And so our measure of creativity is going to be the production of creatives relative to non-creatives. So are you producing more creative individuals relative to the non-creatives? And having the non-creatives is going to do a lot of work for us. So this is the big result. This is an event study, and what we have is the production of creatives before the arrival of a bishopric. Bishopric arrives, and then what production of creatives after. And what we find is in the centuries after the arrival of a bishopric, you get a takeoff in the production of creatives relative to non-creatives. We can do all kinds of fancy controls. We're only studying the same place, and we can control for urban population and things like that. We can control for the number of lawyers produced, the state capacity. Economists have all these theories they like. Just to show you what the event study looks like, this is if you just run it on the creatives, and this is if you run it on the non-creatives. This one takes off, this one does nothing. So, okay, now our idea is that this should be due to the interaction of minds. So can we get anything historically that could be the interaction of minds? And we found in that same data set that they have the birth and death locations of famous people. Okay, so we put that to work. So Europe starts wiring its stuff up after 500. People begin moving around more. And they're 1000 CE, you can see it looks more like a wired together network, and then 1500 CE, even more wired. So what we could show, this may look like exactly the same plot, except this is the bishopric arrives, and what is your network centrality based on the flows of famous people. So what happens is a bishopric arrives, and then people start moving more between other places, bringing in new ideas, allowing for creative recombinations. All right. Now, the question we were asking ourselves is we felt this is persuasive that the church is doing something, but the question is what? Maybe Latin provided a common language and everybody could read Latin, so maybe it was literacy. What we did is we took advantage. The church keeps pretty good records, and the church during this period, the early Middle Ages, is being governed by church councils where bishops come together and discuss a lot of issues. And we were able to determine which councils discussed things like cousin marriage, marriage to in-laws, divorce, inheritance, things related to marriage and the family, versus other issues like whether slaves are allowed to go to church on Sunday, or what happens if a bishop is caught doing something bad. So they're the typical things they discuss. All right. Okay, so what we did is we looked at so we get a lot of variation whether bishops successfully attend these events. And so we can look at your first attendance at synods that had to do with the marriage and the family program. And what we see is that when you attend something that had to do with the marriage and the family program, you get this long-term uptick in creativity as well as centrality. But when it's a different synod, not about the marriage and the family, you have no effect on long-term creativity. So this actually seems to us that this fingers the marriage and family program was the active ingredient. All right. Okay, and then this is actually the modern data. So I'm often making a case for the importance of historical. Yes. Oh yeah, thanks. You're looking at effects that are a couple hundred years after the right. So this is your first attendance at it, and we look at the time from your first attendance at the bishop attended. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully everybody got it. The bishop attended it. And the idea is that, so more background is probably important here. So you get together at these councils, the bishops all agree on something, and then the bishops are supposed to then take this back to their diocese, their bishopric, and enforce the new policies. So they're the conduit for which the church brings the new policies back and enforces it. And of course, the bishops who didn't go, they do eventually get a note that says, hey, you're supposed to do this. But it's not hard to imagine that if you weren't there, you didn't participate in the discussion, maybe you're less enthusiastic about it. Yeah, so this is the kind of long-term effect of these bishops. So, and this is kind of stunning. So I'm actually surprised this worked, but I'm often trying to persuade psychologists that long-term deep historical factors have a lot of effect on modern psychology. So this is a case where if we look at patents per capita, inventors per capita, and now we have our other modern measure of famous creatives, the attendance of your bishop, so this is total attendance at councils that had to do with the marriage and family program, and you can see that has a detectable effect on modern innovation within Europe. Attendance at things that didn't have to do with the marriage and family program have no effect on modern innovation, how innovation your current population is. And remember, we're holding the population of these places, and this is country fixed effect, so we're only comparing places within France and within Germany. All right. Okay, how am I doing on time? Perfect. All right. The idea of gene culture coevolution. So in my book, The Secret of Our Success, I make the case that actually many of the important features of our species are the products of culture driving our genetic evolution. So one simple way to simplify this is at some point in our evolutionary history, we got good enough at cultural transmission so that things began to accumulate, at least under some conditions. So you get the emergence of stone tools and food processing, fire and cooking. That creates a new selective environment that favors larger brains and greater dexterity, and we have really good dexterity in our fingers. And then you get throwing abilities because you can have things to throw like spears, tubers, water containers, and that gives us long distance running abilities because now we can carry water, and that allows us to engage in pursuit hunting. You get tracking technology in medicinal plants, and that has downstream effects on now once we have fancy tools, we don't need all this muscle and stuff, so we can save money on muscle. And anyway, this keeps going. And so I want to think about how the collective brain might have affected our thinking patterns. And so there's three different topics that I've been working on this. I'm going to focus really on the first one. And that's the idea, this question of whether we evolved to think individually or collectively, and to what degree the distribution of knowledge and distribution of thinking is important. At a certain point, if we're a cooperative species and we're interdependent, I should want to harness your cognitive powers, not only your knowledge, but I can use your brain to help me process information, right? So we should be thinking about that. And I was impressed by certain things from the ethnographic record. So my former student, Denise Salila, who works among Congo Basin foragers, is analyzing the medicinal plant knowledge. And her and other ethnographers point out to the following, that when Congo Basin, when a kid gets sick, the parents first use their medicinal knowledge to treat the kid. And if this fails, the whole community gathers around, and elders, and there's a big discussion that goes on about what we should do, and then actions might be taken based on that collective discussion. And if that fails, then they go seek a specialist. So there might be someone who's particularly knowledgeable about things related to this condition, and then they head off to other communities. And what Denise points out in her paper is that the knowledge of medicinal plants, which she then tests and specifically elicits what people know about medicinal plant knowledge, is actually distributed across the group. So no single individual has even most of the knowledge in the group. So as a group, you need the collective knowledge of everybody else to take advantage of this. So we're actually harnessing a knowledge that's distributed amongst other minds. Now, there's still an incentive for kids, for mothers, I guess in this case particularly, to know about medicinal plants, because mom's knowledge of medicinal plants still predicts child's health, but she doesn't know everything, so there's still knowledge stored collectively, distributed amongst other minds. So that really thinks we're dependent for important knowledge that's fitness relevant on this distributed information, and we got to be able to access it. The other place that I find intriguing is tracking knowledge. So Louis Liebenberg talks about how hunters engage in collective discussions as they're tracking. They'll be tracking an animal, they'll come upon a spoor, they'll discuss it, they'll discuss different strategies. Where's the animal heading? What do we got here? And my colleague Steve Pinker points to this stuff and says, yeah, this is evidence that humans have rationality, but he's thinking of the individual arguments made. What I find more intriguing about this case is that it's actually a group discussion. It's a collective intelligence. It's the interaction between them that helped them come to a decision about tracking the animal. And this leads to this research, or this approach discussed by Hugo Mercier. And Hugo points out that, psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out all the heuristics and biases and errors that are part of human decision-making. But when you put individuals in groups and give them the same problems, they do much better. So it's as if we compensate for each other's flawed decision-making. You could imagine cases where we exaggerate each other's flawed decision-making. And I'm sure that happens in some cases, but at least by Mercier's review, it seems like often this helps us deal with logical problems. And he points out that we're cognitively lazy, and we tend to struggle with seeing the problems with our own arguments. But if we hear that argument come out of somebody else's mouth, then we can see all the problems with it. So it's this case where there's definitely seems to be some kind of social interaction. So I'm wondering if, since we're a cooperative species that are long lived in these interdependent groups, it could be we've actually evolved to think together. And we might want to think about that certain key aspects of human decision making and judgment actually should be studied at the small group level among individuals that are tightly bonded. So the other problem I have with studies of collective intelligence is it often puts together strangers. You need to study people who are interdependent, And this is just just decoration, basically. This is from Hugo Mercier's paper, and these numbers would have numbers like 2 and 3, just show the number of how much better people get when they're in small groups as opposed to reasoning individually. Okay, so that's the end. I can take some questions now. One of the main points is that we may have evolved to think in collective brains, and certainly our creativity depends on a whole bunch of factors that are super individual, that on the teams we can participate in, on the neighborhoods we live in. I have a whole section in the book showing the effects of pubs. And this is some of my favorite research. Mike Andrews shows that in the US, different states began imposing prohibition at different times. So this creates a natural experiment. And what Mike shows is that when the saloons close due to prohibition, you might think, well, people are preserving their brains from that alcohol that's going to destroy it. Patenting goes down because they're not meeting in the pubs and swapping ideas and making new baby ideas. Instead, they're staying home, and you can't make recombinations at home. And lots of other evidence. So cities that have good highways are more innovative because the ideas are flowing around. When different cities in Europe and the US get attached to the train network, patenting goes way up because you're bringing in new ideas. Yeah, so any questions? Yes. Yep.
The question I have is if each individual at this point with AI has, what I got from your talk was that if you have this sort of co-intelligence, that human intelligence might be better thought of as intelligence. So with AI, each individual has access to this sort of co-intelligence. How might that change in your creativity? How do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few experiments out there that try to use AI, and the ones I've seen, I mean, this is now a cottage industry, so I may have missed the latest, but it seems to increase the diversity of ideas, but not the overall quality. I mean, one problem with AI is it's sort of the average person. So what people are experimenting with is there a way to give AIs characters, pretend you're a software engineer or something like that, in order to enhance the diversity of creative groups. So you might imagine teams that are combinations of AIs and humans where the AIs are taking on certain personas and have certain, so they can add cognitive diversity to that. Yes?
Well, first, Joe, congratulations. This is great work.
Thanks.
Now, by coincidence, I spent the last 7 years writing a book about this.
Oh, no. I better get this to press. Okay.
And it's called The History of Innovation. It wrestles with collective versus individual, covers much of the same ground you do, and much of your work, with one very different conclusion. What your talk points to is the importance of collective innovation. I agree with that completely, and I think in science we're moving in that direction. But where I differ is about the importance of individual genius. And so I go over a lot of the same history, including the Catholic Church history, asking about individual genius. So a few examples which are persuasive for me about the importance of nurturing individual genius. Newton, he did three very important things. Gravity is saltatory. It doesn't have, the R-square law is unprecedented. The calculus is unprecedented. Leibniz and Newton do it together. I can't find precedents. His work on one of the fundamental colors is collective. That comes out. Skip to the 19th century. Semmelweis is individual. Wash your hands. Everyone opposes that. He's committed, he dies insane. He resists the culture in this case. The Wright brothers, the insight that what you want the rudder to do and what you want the waves to do should follow what birds do is unprecedented. They invent something that's not a recombination. I can't find a recombination, and no one who works on it. Even in the 21st century, search engines, as you point out, are collecting a whole lot of people who have precedence with Page and Ritt. But LLM, which is the heart of Abby's question, reside in three geniuses that are almost unprecedented. Rummel Hart, Jeffrey Hinton, and Jay McClellan all have the insight together that the mathematics requires hidden layers in order to create LLM. So the thrust of what I'm saying is this is just great. And I think you should
Right.
But we must not neglect individual genius.
Okay. Well, so it happens that I have a section in my book addressed to this issue. And so when I would ask people, so I am now going to chase down and read everything I can find on these guys, because the names that people give me are Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. So the chapter is on Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. And what I read about Newton is that he was the student of Isaac Barrow, and he wrote the foreword. He'd already been working on infinitesimals. And he received a letter from Robert Hooke. And in the letter of 1670, I don't remember the dates, but it was 30 years before the Principia. He says, hey, Newton, I was wondering if there's any way that you could show that you get elliptical motion if there was a force pulling to the sun. And one person suggested to me it might be an inverse square law. This is all, you can find this on the web, you can read the letter. So it looks to me like Newton handed him the problem, and apparently Newton worked on this. There's a series of correspondence between those two guys. And then my favorite part of the story is Newton hadn't done anything with this. And Wren, Halley, and Hooke got together after a meeting of the Royal Society at a coffee shop. And at the coffee shop, they were arguing about whether somebody could prove that you can get elliptical orbits using a r squared force gravitation law. And Hooke boasted that he could do it. Halley had tried and failed, and Wren had tried and failed. So Wren had heard about this gifted mathematician nearby, so he headed out to talk to Newton. And when he talked to Newton, that spurred Newton into writing, basically publishing this stuff. So yeah, that's a very different story than the one you want to tell.
One more thing about Catholic Church. So like you, I've been puzzled about your data that where the medieval churches followed more innovation curves. I have a different answer. Cousin marriage is great and wonderful. There's also a doctrine that comes out of the Council of Trent in 1565, in which the Catholics are desperately trying to differentiate themselves from Luther and later from Calvin, and it's doctrinal. The Catholics come out endorsing individual agency as a way to get into heaven. You can do good works and get into heaven, which Luther and Calvin all deny, that you're predestined. And I think it's that doctrine of the importance of individual agency that ties creativity into those who follow what the Catholic Church is doing are more creative.
Okay. But I mean, the data I showed is from before that. So those bishops, so our time series ends in 1500. So those increases are all occurring before this. So
they're both in action.
Okay. Yes. Well, one would be the other technique we use. So we use this famous creatives versus non-famous creatives, and that correlates nicely with patents in places where there's good patent data. Lots of places the patent data is not very good, or patenting isn't really a thing or something. So that would be one. I mean, I have a research grant which has not yet been funded, but the core of the research grant is the following technique for measuring creativity. You need written text, you need poems or something, and you compare each. You take a target poem, you compare it to all prior poems using large language models or something. You get a kind of cosine measure of similarity, cosine similarity measure, and that gives you a measure of novelty. So it tells you how novel that poem is compared to all prior poems. And then you compare it to all future poems, and that gives you a measure of influence. So greater similarity to future stuff is more influence. And then it's the product of those two, novelty and influence, that can give you a measure of creativity. And then you calculate that for every single item, and then you can see what factors would affect that. Yes, Fritz.
Follow the flaws of everyone here. I also wonder about the mechanism that you see inside of that. If you see creativity as recombination of what's already there, the form model, I want to know what mechanism below you favor. And that's actually where I could get a little bit more dark and diverse. It could be competition. You have lots of diversity around you. You have a great competition. It could be a lot of second order observation. Niklas Luhmann system theory. Say you get more other eyes on your thing, you get more hit. It could also be self-control. That would be the Lutheran model on those kind of things.
Yep.
Do you have any in your data favor in your internal models? What's the mechanism of success?
Yes. So in working on this, I mean, there's a fair amount of psychological work looking at teams, but I don't think they get at the actual action that you're interested in. So like the teamwork suggests, for example, that having at least some members who have high levels of cognitive empathy, as measured by the mind in the eyes tasks, that can have that can jump up your creativity. Which might be why having females on your team, because on average they're higher in cognitive empathy. Well, the literature I'm talking about says this, so whether it's true or not was something we can debate. Yeah, and there's this book called Powers of Two by a guy named Schenk, and they argue that, or he argues that the competitiveness among the pairs. So he spends a lot of time on famous pairs, but that they're both cooperative and competitive. He uses Lennon and McCartney as a favorite example. But yeah, I don't have too much to say about that. I am just, I guess I'm operating one notch above that. But I'd certainly be interested in anything you can point me to. I'd love to have more to say on that. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll go to you next. Yeah.
Seems plausible, so there must be something. There must be something I'm not understanding. So in my mind, what you said is something like this. In my town, a bishopric was established, right? And then the bishop goes off to a synod and they talk about family stuff or whatever. And then let's say in the neighboring town, or maybe the bishop is set up 20 years later, and that bishop goes off to a synod and they don't talk about family stuff. And 400 years later, because it seems like, and maybe I did read those, that there's an effect for 300 years, but 400 years later, there's a big difference between those two territories. Is that correct?
So the first thing to remember is there wouldn't be very much difference if they were only 20 years apart, because it's when your curve begins to take off, right? Sure. So you need like 100 years later to really see anything interesting. And the answer is yes, because remember what's going on here is that the local populations are building clans, they have local inheritance, they're tied to their land by ancestors. So all that has to be disassembled by the Catholic Church. So they're ending the veneration of ancestors. This releases people from their land. They're ending cousin marriage. Now you can't build alliances based on marriage. They're ending arranged marriages. So that's why the I do comes in the Catholic ceremony. So they're doing all these things that's breaking these societies down into monogamous nuclear families. This is going to take some time. And people resist this stuff. In fact, the decision of the Catholic Church to sell the right to marry your cousins is because at first they didn't do this for centuries. And then they realized we can cash in on this because we can sell people the right to marry their cousins because people still wanted to marry their cousins.
I guess the establishment of the bishop, like it makes sense that would have an effect. But the synod, whether the bishop went to the synod to talk about one thing as opposed to another, I feel like it must be confounded with something else, right? Like talk about that.
I was surprised too. But yeah, but I mean, it depends how seriously or how much of a big effect it was that the bishop went and came back and said, now I'm committed to enforcing this practices versus the guy who couldn't go for whatever reason, missed it. I'm supposed to do what? Yeah, so. Yes.
Want to ask a slightly more modern question, which is I'm interested. Surely you've given some thought to, with respect to the collective brain, the nature of what kinds of collectives matter, and whether sort of modern technology and connections and collectives are fundamentally different in some way from what you get in the pub, for example, right? So, do you have any thoughts on whether social media and those kinds of technological connections work in the same way as
you and he's sitting at the pub. And
Right. I mean, there's a whole bunch there. One thing is that we're not good at building trust on social media. So face-to-face interactions still seem to be the best way to build trust. And in order for me to tell you my best idea, I'm probably going to have some trust unless I've already published on it or something. So the building up of trust is really important. The importance of serendipitous events is really important. So I mentioned some serendipity, but like, so one example that I'm realizing in retrospect I should have used for this crowd is that the 2023 Nobel Prize in Medicine went to Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, who met at the medical library while they were photocopying stuff. And they got to talking, and that was eventually the 2023 Nobel Prize, and saved millions of lives in the pandemic. So you don't have Zoom calls where you bump into someone on Zoom or something, I guess is the point. Yes, you guys.
I love that point. Pubs are the answer to all problems in American Sweden. What good pubs actually are, but I was curious about the chapter that you didn't talk about on music, and then like Marty, I was also thinking about individuals who really exemplify what I've always thought of as individual creativity, and the not always replicated association between things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with artistic creativeness, whether music or art or
right,
and how that fits with your.
Yeah. So one way you might interpret the idea of the collective brain, if you're really interested in individuals, would be part of what makes you capable of producing ideas unique in your time has to do with your particular social connections and your willingness to interconnect. So one important thing about the Newton story is it's not long before Newton that these private mail delivery services began to pop up. So I have this image in my book of Newton's network of correspondence. He hardly ever left his office, but he was in contact with letters with all the great scholars all over Europe. So he's part of this collective brain of flowing knowledge. And if there wasn't mail, he would have just been a lonely guy at Cambridge, right? So one thing is about your sort of particular historical context and your social relationships. And there does seem to be this thing, like, for example, in the Einstein case, Einstein and Poincaré come up with about the same idea at the same time. It's mathematically the same, except Einstein pitches it as the radical form, that the nature of the universe is different than how we thought. And Poincaré has it as kind of a fudge factor. Einstein is like a young bohemian who's moved out of Germany. He lives with his non-Jewish girlfriend, which wasn't appropriate for his family. So he's like, on the edge, and he's working in the patent office because he can't get an academic job because he criticizes his professors. Whereas Poincaré is like the French establishment guy. He's already widely respected. So he doesn't do the risky thing as opposed to Einstein. So different point in your careers. Einstein, amazingly, later falls into the same trap. So he refuses to accept quantum mechanics, and he spends his whole career battling quantum mechanics, and he has this debate with Bohr, and because it doesn't appeal to him intuitively, even though it keeps making correct predictions. So time of life matters as well. Does that help at all?
I was curious about them.
Oh, the musicians. Let me tell you about the musicians. So I'm drawing here on Karol Borwicki. He's an economist in Europe, and he does this great work where he takes compositions which have all been published and digitizes it. And then he compares every composition and every composer to all the others. And he looks at, and what he finds is consistent with these ideas is that composers' compositions definitely resemble their mentors, but they also resemble the city around them. So it's like they're taking information from their peers and they're recombining it with stuff from their mentors. And it shows that if you have a more prestigious mentor, your stuff is more respected later on. If you have a less prestigious mentor, it's less respected. So you got to choose wisely when you're picking mentors. Yeah. So and you see the size effect. So when you live in a city that has more fellow composers, then your stuff is more impactful. Now the question is, what's impact, and how this is. Karol did the best he could with what he had. Is he uses Spotify downloads. He uses how big your biography is in these giant musical tomes and he uses, there was a couple of famous books that rank the great composers, so he uses those. They all tell the same story, so it's kind of nice. Right.
My question, so what are your thoughts on why our intuition for what creativity is, who's responsible for it, how we just experience creativity is such a mismatch between your sort of explanation of this.
Well, I don't have any strong theories on that, but I did present you with the myth of the heroic inventor at the beginning, which I think is a foundational myth. It makes a good story. Journalists love it. Well, I've been resistant to go there. However, this is a hypothesis, is that it's stronger in the West because of individualism. So when we judge someone, we don't look at their social connections. We want to know what their trustworthiness is, their loyaltiness is. We want to attach attributes to them. That's the core of individualism. So we're more likely to explain. So when the fundamental attribution error, which isn't fundamental, but it is strongest in the West, is when you explain things, say someone is late for work because they're lazy, they're not very hardworking, as opposed to their tire broke down, right? So that is a tendency to attach attributes and explain things due to attributes. So when we say someone is creative, we're attaching an attribute to them, and so it's the fundamental attribution error, essentially. So that's one idea. Yes? Yeah. Okay. I made up the lazy bishops just now for this talk, so I'll have to. I love good chapter headings.
Really shuts down in 1994. So is there then, a further plausible story where you see effects of that shutdown?
Yes. Yes. So there's a large literature in economics on this, but they use the quotas to show that you get a decline in the fields where the immigrants were coming from the countries that got shut down. So the big hit is Eastern Europeans get shut out, and they were leading the way in a whole bunch of fields, and suddenly the US takes a nosedive in those fields. Now, if a non-collective brain story would be that, well, maybe they were taking the ideas from the Americans, from the native-born Americans, but actually they were fertilizing. So the Americans get less creative in those domains because they don't have the incoming flow. And the literature shows that really nicely. Yes?
Where you need a collectivity to have creativity and innovation, but you need individuals who are to create that diversity. So at some point we talk about individualism and how that affects innovation, but you can't go too far in that direction.
Right. Right. And so I discussed this in my book, The Weirdest People in the World. It so happens that I cut my teeth as an anthropologist working among a group called the Machiganga. And the Machiganga are extremely individualistic, but they're deeply distrusting of strangers. So they live in small family units scattered throughout the Peruvian Amazon. But yet they have this strong kind of rugged individualism type view, but they really are distrustful of anybody outside their hamlet. So you need two dimensions. You need individualism plus impersonal pro-sociality, so this willingness to trust strangers. I mean, collectivism can be tricky because collectivists are often, they have borders too, right? So it all depends at what level, I wish we were all global collectivists, but that doesn't seem to have ever been a thing.